Another potential coronavirus impact in our state, we are talking about the general primary election, which is currently set for May 19th. It's already been pushed back once. As it stands, Georgia will vote on the Democratic Party nominee for president, as well as various congressional races here in our state, including a Democratic opponent there for Senator David Perdue. So what's going to happen with this now? There are some political forces in place now in the state who want to move that primary to an even later date because of the coronavirus. That would require some major legislative or even some executive action to be taken. We asked Georgia Secretary of State how that process might play out.
We would actually require an act of the General Assembly. So the leadership of the General Assembly could meet and decide to just change that law, and they're not in session right now, or an act of the governor as part of an emergency declaration. But absent that, then we have to plan for this election. And if we do get that at some point, then we'll, as I said, we will gladly move it to a different time. Our job is to execute elections, it's not to create them.
Right now, early in-person voting is scheduled to begin April 27th. But remember this, the state is sending out absentee request forms to every Georgia voter, meaning you can ask to vote absentee if you don't want to risk going out in person between April 27th and May 19th.